blood spilled across cathedral stones has a way of echoing through history. But when that blood belongs to an archbishop, murdered at the very altar where he once blessed kings and commoners alike, it becomes something more than violence. It becomes a message written in crimson that will haunt a kingdom for centuries. December 29th, 1170, Canterbury Cathedral. The most sacred space in England became a butcher's floor, as 4 knights systematically dismantled a man who had once been the most powerful figure in the realm, second only to the king himself. Their victim wasn't just any churchman. Thomas Becket had been Henry II's closest friend, his trusted chancellor, his brother in all but blood. Yet on that winter evening, as Vespers bells tolled across the cathedral grounds, these same men who had sworn loyalty to the crown transformed into executioners, methodically destroying the man who had dared to place God's law above the king's will. What you're about to discover isn't simply the story of a political assassination. It's a tale of friendship corrupted by power, of absolute authority meeting immovable principle, and of how a king's frustrated outburst became the spark that ignited one of medieval Europe's most shocking murders. The methods used to kill Thomas Becket were not chosen for efficiency. They were calculated acts of symbolic violence, designed to send a message about the price of defying royal power. But this story begins long before that December night, in the unlikely friendship between 2 men who would reshape England's destiny. A friendship so intimate that contemporary observers said they shared one heart and one mind, yet so fundamentally doomed that its destruction would shake the very foundations of medieval society. Thomas Becket was born around 1120 into a world where London's merchant class was beginning to challenge the traditional dominance of Norman nobility. His father, Gilbert Becket, was a prosperous tradesman from Cheapside, successful enough to provide his son with an education that would open doors to the highest levels of English society. Yet Thomas carried the stigma of his common birth throughout his life, a vulnerability that his enemies would eventually exploit with deadly effectiveness. Medieval England was a kingdom caught between 2 authorities that claimed absolute loyalty. The crown demanded unquestioning obedience from all subjects, while the church insisted that its own laws superseded royal commands when matters of faith were concerned. This fundamental tension had simmered for generations, occasionally erupting into open conflict, but never with the personal intensity that would characterize the struggle between Henry II and Thomas Becket. The England that shaped both men was a realm still defining itself after the Norman conquest. A century after Hastings, the integration of Norman rulers with Saxon subjects remained incomplete, creating opportunities for ambitious individuals to rise based on merit rather than bloodline. For someone like Thomas Becket, born neither Norman nor Saxon but of merchant stock, exceptional ability became the key to advancement. Thomas's intelligence and diplomatic skills soon attracted attention in the higher circles. By his early 30s, he had caught the eye of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, who recognized the young man's potential and brought him into his household. This appointment proved to be the foundation of everything that followed, introducing Thomas to the complex world of church politics, and more fatefully, to the court of the young Henry Plantagenet. When Henry Plantagenet became King Henry II of England in 1154 at the age of 21, he inherited more than just a crown. He controlled vast territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making him one of Europe's most powerful rulers. Yet for all his territorial holdings, Henry understood that effective governance required trusted administrators who could translate royal will into practical action. In Thomas Becket, he found exactly such a man. The friendship that developed between king and chancellor was extraordinary by medieval standards. Henry was known for his restless energy, his fierce intelligence, and his volcanic temper. Thomas matched him in wit and surpassed him in administrative skill, becoming the architect of Henry's governmental reforms. They hunted together, travelled together, and shared a vision of England transformed into a more efficiently governed kingdom. Contemporary observers marvelled at their closeness. The chronicler William Fitzstephen noted that Henry and Thomas were inseparable, their partnership so seamless that distinguishing between royal command and chancellor's advice became impossible. When Henry needed someone to implement unpopular policies, Thomas wielded the bureaucratic machinery with ruthless efficiency. When diplomatic finesse was required, Thomas's merchant son understanding of negotiation served the crown perfectly. As Chancellor, Thomas Becket accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled the greatest nobles in the realm. He maintained a household larger than many earls, entertained foreign dignitaries with displays of magnificence that awed even hardened courtiers, and demonstrated a taste for luxury that seemed to contradict his relatively humble origins. His enemies would later claim this ostentation revealed the merchant's son beneath the courtly facade. But Thomas understood that in medieval politics, the appearance of power was often indistinguishable from power itself. The transformation of Thomas Becket from royal favourite to religious zealot remains one of history's most dramatic personality changes. When Archbishop Theobald died in 1161, Henry saw an opportunity to extend royal control over the church by appointing his loyal chancellor to the highest ecclesiastical position in England. The king's calculation seemed logical. Thomas had served royal interests faithfully for 7 years, often at the expense of church prerogatives. Who better to continue that service as Archbishop? Yet the moment Thomas accepted the appointment, something fundamental shifted in his character. The man who had lived for worldly success suddenly embraced radical austerity. The chancellor who had collected revenues from church lands now defended ecclesiastical privileges with fanatical intensity. It was as if donning the archbishop's robes had triggered a complete spiritual awakening, transforming Henry's closest ally into his most dangerous opponent. Modern historians debate whether this transformation was genuine religious conversion or calculated political strategy. Perhaps Thomas recognized that his position as archbishop required different loyalties than his role as chancellor. Perhaps he understood that the church's growing power offered a more secure foundation for his ambitions than royal favor, which could be withdrawn at any time. Or perhaps, as his contemporaries believed, he experienced a genuine spiritual awakening that made his previous life seem empty and corrupt. What cannot be disputed is the thoroughness of his transformation. Thomas resigned the chancellorship immediately, much to Henry's fury. He began wearing a hair shirt beneath his ceremonial robes, a brutal garment crawling with lice that caused constant discomfort as a form of religious penance. He adopted the austere lifestyle of a monk, fasting regularly and spending hours in prayer. Most significantly, he began opposing royal policies that he had previously implemented without question. The first major conflict erupted over the issue of criminous clerks, members of the clergy who committed serious crimes. Henry insisted that such individuals should be tried in royal courts and subject to the same punishments as any other criminal. This seemed reasonable enough to modern sensibilities, but medieval church law claimed exclusive jurisdiction over all ecclesiastical personnel. A priest who committed murder could be defrocked by church courts, but could not be executed by royal justice. For Henry, this principle represented an intolerable limitation on royal authority. His reforms aimed at creating uniform justice throughout his territories, and clerical immunity violated that vision. For Thomas, the principle represented the fundamental independence of God's law from earthly authority. The Church claimed to derive its authority directly from Christ, making it superior to any temporal power including kings. The dispute escalated rapidly from legal technicality to constitutional crisis. At the Council of Clarendon in 1164, Henry presented a comprehensive set of reforms designed to restrict church privileges and extend royal jurisdiction. The constitutions of Clarendon, as they became known, required that church courts hand over convicted criminals to royal justice for punishment, restricted appeals to Rome, and subjected church lands to royal taxation. Thomas initially appeared to accept these reforms, but then dramatically reversed his position, claiming that his earlier agreement had been extracted under duress. This reversal humiliated Henry publicly and made reconciliation increasingly difficult. The king had staked his credibility on securing church cooperation with his reforms, and Thomas's defiance made the royal authority appear weak and ineffective. The personal dimension of their conflict made it particularly bitter. Henry felt betrayed by a man he had elevated from obscurity to the highest positions in the realm. Thomas, in turn, seemed to view his former friendship with the king as a spiritual corruption that required dramatic penance. Their dispute transcended politics to become a clash between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The situation deteriorated further when Henry summoned Thomas to appear before a royal court at Northampton Castle in October 1164. The charges against the Archbishop included financial irregularities from his time as Chancellor and contempt of royal authority. The trial was clearly intended to humiliate Thomas and force his submission, but the Archbishop arrived prepared for confrontation rather than capitulation. The scenes at Northampton revealed how completely their relationship had disintegrated. Henry's supporters shouted, "Traitor!" at Thomas as he entered the hall, while the Archbishop responded with equal hostility, denouncing royal attempts to subordinate God's church to earthly authority. The personal animosity was palpable, witnesses reported, with both men barely able to contain their rage when forced into the same room. Thomas recognized that remaining in England would mean either submission or destruction. In a dramatic gesture that shocked contemporary observers, he fled the kingdom in secret, crossing the English Channel to seek refuge in France. His escape was a calculated insult to Henry's authority, demonstrating that even the highest church official preferred exile to accepting royal supremacy. The 6 years Thomas spent in exile, from 1164 to 1170, allowed the initial fury to cool, but created new grievances that would prove even more dangerous. From his base in France, Thomas conducted a propaganda campaign against Henry's ecclesiastical policies, appealing to the Pope and other European rulers for support. He portrayed himself as a martyr for church independence, suffering persecution for refusing to compromise God's law. Henry, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated internationally as Thomas's campaign gained momentum. The Pope threatened to place England under interdict, a spiritual punishment that would close all churches and deny religious services to the entire kingdom. Foreign rulers who had their own conflicts with assertive clergy began to view Henry's situation as a test case for royal authority throughout Europe. The pressure for reconciliation grew from multiple directions. Neither man could achieve his goals while the conflict continued. Henry needed ecclesiastical approval for his son's coronation, while Thomas wanted to return to his archbishopric. In 1170, both sides agreed to negotiations that seemed to offer hope for a peaceful resolution. The reconciliation meeting between Henry and Thomas in July 1170 appeared to resolve their differences. Henry agreed to restore Thomas's properties and privileges, while Thomas seemed to accept the king's authority in temporal matters. Contemporary observers reported that the two men embraced and appeared genuinely moved by their reunion after 6 years of bitter hostility. Yet this reconciliation was more fragile than it appeared. Neither man had truly abandoned his fundamental position, and their agreement papered over differences that remained as irreconcilable as ever. Thomas returned to England in December 1170, amid great popular celebration, but his first actions suggested that nothing had really changed. The final crisis erupted when Thomas learned that Henry had crowned his eldest son as co-king during the Archbishop's absence. This coronation should have been performed by the Archbishop of Canterbury as a matter of ancient custom, but Henry had used the Archbishop of York instead. For Thomas, this violation of Canterbury's prerogatives represented a direct assault on his authority and dignity. Rather than accepting the fait accompli diplomatically, Thomas chose confrontation. Before leaving France, he issued letters excommunicating the Archbishop of York and 2 other bishops who had participated in the unauthorized coronation. This was not merely a religious gesture, it was a declaration of war against Henry's ecclesiastical settlement. News of these excommunications reached Henry at his Christmas court in Normandy, where he was celebrating the successful coronation of his heir. The king's reaction was explosive, fueled by years of accumulated frustration and the humiliation of seeing his carefully planned ceremonies invalidated by his defiant archbishop. The exact words Henry spoke in his rage remain disputed by historians, but their effect was unmistakable. According to the most widely accepted contemporary account by Edward Grimm, the king cried out, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" The famous phrase, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" was actually a later literary invention, created in the 18th century and popularized through countless retellings. But Henry's actual words, with their contemptuous reference to Thomas's humble birth and their implicit challenge to his followers' loyalty, proved even more inflammatory than the sanitized version history remembers. 4 knights heard the king's outburst and interpreted it as a royal command that offered them the opportunity to prove their loyalty while eliminating a persistent threat to royal authority. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton left the Norman court secretly, crossed the English Channel, and rode hard for Canterbury with deadly purpose. These were not random courtiers seeking royal favor. They were experienced knights with their own grievances against Thomas and their own reasons for wanting him eliminated. Fitzurse had family connections to the disputed succession, while de Tracy held lands that had been affected by ecclesiastical claims. Their decision to act represented both personal vendetta and political calculation. The 4 knights reached Canterbury on December 29th, 1170, as the December light was already fading into winter dusk. Their arrival at the cathedral compound marked the beginning of one of medieval Europe's most shocking acts of political violence, but it also represented the inevitable culmination of conflicts that had been building for decades. The winter twilight of December 29th, 1170, descended upon Canterbury like a shroud, its grey light casting long shadows across the cathedral precincts as 4 armed men rode through the ancient gates with murder in their hearts. The hoofbeats of their horses echoed off the stone walls with an ominous rhythm that seemed to announce the approaching end of an era. These were not common brigands or desperate outlaws, but members of Henry II's inner circle, men whose family names commanded respect across Norman England, now transformed into instruments of royal vengeance. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton had ridden hard from Normandy, covering the distance from Henry's court to Canterbury in just 4 days. Their urgency was not born of simple obedience to royal commands, but from a more complex mixture of ambition, loyalty, and personal grievance that made them perfect vessels for the king's rage. Each carried his own reasons for wanting Thomas Becket eliminated. reasons that went beyond mere political calculation to touch the very foundations of their honor and status. The four knights dismounted outside Canterbury Cathedral as the winter afternoon faded into evening, their breath visible in the cold air as they surveyed the massive structure that had been the seat of English Christianity for over 5 centuries. The cathedral's imposing Norman architecture, with its thick walls and narrow windows, seemed designed to repel invasion, yet they had come not as conquerors, but as executioners, armed with what they believed to be royal authority to destroy the most powerful churchmen in England. According to the eyewitness account of Gervase of Canterbury, the knights displayed a cunning awareness of the symbolic significance of their mission. They placed their weapons beneath a tree outside the cathedral walls and concealed their armor beneath heavy cloaks, presenting themselves initially as unarmed men seeking dialogue rather than confrontation. This calculated deception revealed their understanding that what they were about to do required careful staging to maintain even the pretense of legitimacy. The Archbishop's palace, adjacent to the cathedral, buzzed with the routine activities of the ecclesiastical household as servants prepared for the evening meal and clerks completed their daily correspondence. Thomas Becket, now 50 years old and bearing the physical toll of his years in exile, was engaged in discussions with his advisors about the ongoing tensions with the king's supporters when word came that 4 knights sought audience with him. The confrontation that followed in the palace hall would be remembered and retold for centuries, each witness adding details that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between the worldviews represented by the Archbishop and his visitors. The knights, still maintaining their facade of diplomatic mission, demanded that Thomas lift the excommunications he had imposed on the Archbishop of York and the 2 bishops who had participated in the young Henry's coronation. Fitzurse, apparently serving as spokesman for the group, delivered their ultimatum with the blunt directness of men accustomed to having their words obeyed without question. He informed Thomas that the king commanded him to absolve the excommunicated bishops immediately and to present himself at Winchester to answer for his defiance of royal authority. The demand was not merely political, but personal, challenging Thomas's fundamental identity as Archbishop of Canterbury and his allegiance to principles he considered more sacred than life itself. Thomas's response revealed both the man he had become and the Archbishop he had chosen to be. Rather than showing fear or seeking compromise, he met their threats with a composure that seemed to infuriate his visitors. According to Edward Grimm's account, written by the only man who remained loyal to Thomas throughout the ordeal, the Archbishop declared that he would never submit to royal commands that violated the sacred privileges of the Church. The exchange escalated rapidly from formal demands to personal insults as the knights abandoned their pretense of diplomatic courtesy. They accused Thomas of ingratitude toward the king, who had elevated him from obscurity, of treachery against the crown that had showered him with honors, and of arrogance in presuming to judge royal actions. Their words revealed not just political opposition, but genuine personal hatred for a man they saw as having betrayed every principle of loyalty and friendship. Thomas, far from being intimidated by their verbal assault, responded with equal intensity, defending his actions as necessary measures to protect the Church's independence from royal interference. He reminded them that his loyalty to God superseded any earthly allegiance, and that he would suffer death rather than compromise the sacred duties of his office. This was not mere rhetorical posturing, but a genuine declaration of his willingness to become a martyr for principles he considered eternal. The failure of dialogue became apparent as both sides recognized that no compromise was possible. The knights had come expecting either submission or a pretext for violence, while Thomas had chosen a path that made both outcomes equally unacceptable to his conscience. The confrontation had reached the point where words became inadequate, and force appeared to be the only remaining option. What happened next revealed the calculated nature of their mission. The knights abruptly left the palace hall, claiming they needed to confer among themselves, but in reality retrieving the weapons they had concealed outside the cathedral. This brief intermission provided a crucial window of opportunity for Thomas to escape or seek sanctuary, yet he chose instead to proceed with his evening prayers as if nothing unusual had occurred. The monks of Canterbury, recognizing the mortal danger their archbishop faced, pleaded with him to bar the doors of the palace or flee to safety while time remained. Their terror was palpable, as they understood better than Thomas himself the implications of 4 armed knights departing in anger from an unsuccessful negotiation. Yet Thomas, displaying either remarkable courage or fatal obstinacy, refused to alter his routine or show any sign of fear. As Vespers approached, Thomas proceeded toward the cathedral for evening prayers, accompanied by a small group of clerical attendants who had not yet grasped the full magnitude of the threat they faced. The short walk from the palace to the cathedral, a journey Thomas had made countless times during his years as Archbishop, now took on the character of a final procession toward martyrdom. The interior of Canterbury Cathedral, as evening prayers began, presented a scene of deceptive normalcy. The massive stone pillars rose toward the vaulted ceiling, like prayers made manifest in architecture, while the soft light of countless candles flickered against walls that had witnessed centuries of worship. The monks' voices rose in the ancient melodies of Vespers, their Latin chants echoing through the sacred space, with a beauty that seemed to deny the possibility of violence within these consecrated walls. Thomas took his accustomed place among the worshippers, his tall figure commanding attention, even in the act of prayer. At 50 years old, he bore the marks of his transformation from worldly chancellor to ascetic archbishop. The hair shirt he wore beneath his ceremonial robes had left his body scarred and weakened, while years of fasting and spiritual discipline had carved deep lines into his once handsome face. Yet there remained about him an aura of authority that even his enemies acknowledged. The 4 knights, now fully armed and armor-clad, approached the cathedral with the grim determination of men who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Their weapons gleamed dully in the fading light as they strode through the cathedral precincts, no longer making any attempt to conceal their deadly purpose. The few servants and pilgrims who encountered them fled in terror, understanding instinctively that these were not men who could be reasoned with or deterred. The massive doors of Canterbury Cathedral stood open as tradition demanded, their bronze fittings reflecting the last rays of daylight that slanted through the December gloom. The sound of the monks singing Vespers drifted out into the evening air, a counterpoint to the harsh clatter of armed men approaching with murderous intent. The contrast between the sacred music and the approaching violence created a tension that seemed to charge the very air with foreboding. When the 4 knights burst through the cathedral doors, their entrance shattered the peaceful atmosphere, like a stone thrown through glass. The singing stopped abruptly as monks and worshippers turned in horror to see armed men advancing through the sacred space with drawn swords. The violation of sanctuary was so shocking that many witnesses would later describe the moment as supernatural, as if the very foundations of Christian civilization were being tested. Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the kingdom? Fitzurse's voice echoed through the vast interior with a harshness that seemed to desecrate the holy space. The accusation of treason, shouted within the walls of England's premier cathedral, represented more than mere political opposition. It was a fundamental challenge to the principle that spiritual authority could exist independently of royal power. The terrified congregation scattered like leaves before a storm, scrambling for hiding places behind pillars and altars as the armed knights advanced. Only a handful of clerks remained visible, and of these, Only Edward Grimm, a visiting monk from Cambridge, chose to stand beside his Archbishop rather than seek safety in flight. This single act of loyalty would provide history with its most detailed account of what followed. Thomas, displaying the composure that had characterized his transformation from courtier to saint, stepped forward to face his accusers. His voice, clear and unwavering despite the circumstances, carried across the cathedral as he declared, "Here I am, not a traitor to the king, but a priest of God. What do you want?" The deliberate emphasis on his religious identity, rather than his political position, revealed his understanding that this confrontation transcended mere earthly power struggles. The knight's response was immediate and violent. Rather than engaging in further dialogue, they attempted to drag Thomas bodily from the cathedral, apparently hoping to avoid the sacrilege of spilling blood within the consecrated walls. Their plan suggested a residual respect for religious sanctuary, even as they prepared to commit murder, reflecting the complex relationship between faith and politics that characterized medieval society. Thomas's resistance to their efforts proved more formidable than they had anticipated. Despite being outnumbered and unarmed, he fought against their attempts to remove him with a strength that seemed to surprise even his attackers. Grasping a pillar in the north transept with desperate determination, he made it impossible for them to drag him away without using their weapons. His defiance forced them to choose between abandoning their mission and committing the ultimate sacrilege of murder within the cathedral itself. The first sword blow fell without warning, a vicious downward stroke that sliced through the crown of Thomas's head with such force that it exposed the bone beneath. The monk, Edward Grimm, attempting to shield his archbishop with his own body, caught part of the blow on his arm, nearly severing it completely. The sight of blood flowing from both the archbishop and his defender seemed to break whatever restraint had held the knights back from their full fury. The second blow struck Thomas as he fell to his knees, the impact driving him forward onto the stone floor of the cathedral. Yet even as death approached, witnesses reported that he continued to pray, his lips moving in silent communion with the God he had chosen to serve above all earthly authorities. The image of the dying archbishop, maintaining his faith even as swords rained down upon him, would become one of the most powerful symbols of religious martyrdom in medieval Europe. The third blow was the most devastating, delivered with such savagery that it split Thomas's skull completely open, spilling his brains across the cathedral floor. The knight responsible for this final assault, identified by some accounts as Richard le Breton, seemed to take particular satisfaction in the thoroughness of the destruction he had wrought. His actions suggested not merely the completion of a mission, but the expression of a deep, personal hatred that demanded the complete obliteration of his victim. The fourth and final act of desecration came from an unexpected source. Hugh of Horsea, a subdeacon who had accompanied the knights as a guide rather than a combatant, placed his foot upon the neck of the dying archbishop and scattered the remaining contents of his skull across the stone floor. His action, accompanied by the shouted declaration, "Let us away, knights! This fellow will arise no more," represented the ultimate violation of both religious sanctuary and human dignity. The immediate aftermath of the murder revealed the psychological impact of what had just occurred. The four knights, their mission accomplished, stood in stunned silence amid the carnage they had created. The cathedral, moments before filled with the voices of prayer and praise, now echoed only with the dripping of blood and the distant sounds of people fleeing in terror. Even the perpetrators seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of their transgression. Edward Grimm, his arm nearly severed and hanging useless at his side, managed to crawl to safety behind the high altar where other members of Thomas's household had taken refuge. His survival would prove crucial to history, as his eyewitness account would provide future generations with the most detailed and reliable record of these events. The courage he had shown in attempting to defend his Archbishop, despite having no personal relationship with him, demonstrated the powerful effect Thomas's spiritual authority had on those who encountered him. The knights' departure from the cathedral was as abrupt as their entrance had been dramatic. Loading themselves with whatever portable valuables they could find in the Archbishop's quarters, they rode away into the winter night, leaving behind a scene that would haunt England for generations. Their haste suggested an awareness that they had committed an act so shocking that even royal protection might not shield them from its consequences. The body of Thomas Becket lay where it had fallen, the stone floor around it stained with blood and brain matter that would never be completely cleansed. The sight was so horrific that even hardened clerics who had witnessed many deaths found themselves unable to approach immediately. The transformation of England's premier cathedral into a slaughterhouse seemed to violate every principle of Christian civilization. Yet even as the immediate horror of the murder sank in, the process of creating a saint had already begun. Within hours of the attack, local people were collecting pieces of cloth soaked in Thomas's blood, convinced that they possessed miraculous properties. The speed with which popular devotion emerged suggested that Thomas's death had fulfilled rather than frustrated his spiritual destiny. The monks of Canterbury, overcoming their initial shock and fear, began the solemn task of preparing their Archbishop's body for burial. What they discovered during this process would add another layer to the growing legend of Thomas's sanctity. Beneath his magnificent archiepiscopal robes, they found the coarse hair shirt he had worn constantly since becoming Archbishop, a garment crawling with lice that had caused him constant discomfort as a form of voluntary penance. This revelation of Thomas's secret asceticism transformed the narrative of his life and death from political tragedy to spiritual triumph. The man who had appeared to live in luxury had actually been practicing the most severe forms of self-mortification, his outward magnificence concealing an inner life of extraordinary devotion. The contrast between appearance and reality seemed to validate his claims to spiritual authority over temporal power. As news of the Archbishop's murder spread throughout England and across Europe, the reaction was one of universal horror and condemnation. Even those who had opposed Thomas's policies found themselves shocked by the brutality of his end and the violation of sanctuary it represented. The four knights, who had hoped to earn royal gratitude for eliminating a troublesome opponent, found themselves instead becoming objects of universal execration. King Henry II, still in Normandy when word of the murder reached him, reportedly collapsed upon hearing the news, understanding immediately that his moment of rage had triggered a catastrophe that would haunt his reign forever. The man he had hoped to silence through intimidation had instead become infinitely more powerful in death than he had ever been in life, his martyrdom transforming him into a symbol of resistance to royal tyranny that would inspire opposition for centuries to come. In death, Thomas Becket achieved what he had never managed in life, the complete and total defeat of royal authority over spiritual matters. The blood pooling on the cathedral floor, the scattered fragments of skull and brain matter gleaming in the candlelight, the stunned silence that followed the knight's departure. All of this became the foundation for one of medieval Europe's most powerful cults of sainthood. What began as political murder transformed almost instantly into spiritual triumph, as if the very stones of Canterbury Cathedral bore witness to a divine reversal of earthly power. The transformation began within hours of the murder, driven not by church hierarchy or royal decree, but by the spontaneous devotion of ordinary people who understood intuitively that they had witnessed something beyond mere political violence. Local citizens crept into the cathedral after the knights departed, drawn by curiosity that quickly gave way to reverence as they encountered the scene of Thomas's death. The sight of the Archbishop's body, his skull split open, and his blood mixing with the ancient stones, seemed to radiate an otherworldly significance that transcended the brutal circumstances of his demise. These first witnesses possessed the medieval instinct for recognizing sanctity through suffering. They understood that martyrdom was not simply death for a cause, but death that revealed the divine working through human flesh. As they knelt beside Thomas's corpse, many began tearing strips of cloth from their own garments to soak in his blood, convinced they were collecting the most precious relics imaginable. Others gathered fragments of bone and brain matter scattered by the knights, handling these grisly remains with the reverence normally reserved for the most sacred objects. The monks of Canterbury, having recovered from their initial terror, began the delicate process of preparing their Archbishop's body for burial, while simultaneously recognizing that they were handling the remains of a potential saint. The discovery of Thomas's secret asceticism, the hair shirt crawling with lice, the evidence of constant self-mortification hidden beneath his magnificent robes, provided immediate validation for claims of his sanctity. Here was proof that the man they had known as an imperious archbishop had been living the life of a hermit, his outer magnificence concealing an inner dedication to spiritual purification. Brother Benedict of Peterborough, one of the monks charged with recording the events surrounding Thomas's death, began documenting what would become an avalanche of miraculous reports. The first alleged miracle occurred within days of the murder, when a local woman claimed that water mixed with Thomas's blood had cured her son's fever. More reports followed with startling frequency. The blind receiving sight, the lame walking, the possessed freed from demonic influence. Each story was carefully investigated and recorded, creating a detailed archive of supernatural activity that would support the case for Thomas's canonization. The speed with which these miracle reports emerged suggests something more profound than mere wishful thinking or political manipulation. Medieval society possessed a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between sanctity and miraculous power, expecting genuine saints to demonstrate their heavenly status through tangible interventions in earthly affairs. Thomas's reputed miracles covered the full spectrum of divine healing. Physical ailments disappeared, mental illnesses resolved, and spiritual torments found peace through his intercession. Within months of his death, Canterbury Cathedral had become a pilgrimage destination of unprecedented importance. The trickle of local visitors soon swelled into a flood of travelers from across Europe, all seeking healing, forgiveness, or simply the spiritual benefit of proximity to a genuine saint. The cathedral infrastructure, designed for monastic worship and episcopal ceremony, struggled to accommodate the growing crowds of pilgrims who arrived daily seeking access to Thomas's tomb. Pope Alexander III, who had supported Thomas during his conflict with Henry II, moved with remarkable speed to investigate claims of his sanctity. The normal canonization process, which typically required decades of careful examination, was compressed into less than 3 years. On February 21st, 1173, just over 2 years after the murder, Thomas Becket was officially declared a saint by papal decree. This represented one of the fastest canonizations in medieval history, reflecting both the overwhelming evidence of his miraculous powers and the political necessity of the Church asserting its spiritual authority in the wake of his violent death. The official recognition of Thomas's sainthood unleashed an explosion of devotional activity that transformed not just Canterbury Cathedral, but the entire geography of medieval pilgrimage. Canterbury joined Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela as one of Christianity's premier pilgrimage destinations, attracting visitors from every corner of the known world. The cathedral monks, recognizing the commercial, as well as spiritual opportunities presented by this development, began systematically organizing the pilgrimage experience. The shrine erected over Thomas's tomb became a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship and religious theatre. Constructed of the finest materials available, gold, silver, precious gems, and exotic woods, it was designed to overwhelm visitors with its magnificence while focusing their devotion on the saint's miraculous powers. The tomb itself was positioned to allow pilgrims to insert their heads through openings in the surrounding screen, bringing them into direct physical contact with the saint's remains while maintaining the shrine's security and dignity. Enterprising monks developed an entire economy around Thomas's relics and reputation. St. Thomas water, a mixture containing microscopic amounts of the saint's blood diluted in vast quantities of ordinary water, was bottled and sold in specially designed lead ampullae that pilgrims could take home as proof of their journey. These small vessels, decorated with images of Thomas's murder and resurrection, became some of the most widely distributed religious artifacts of the medieval period. The pilgrimage to Canterbury developed its own elaborate rituals and traditions that reflected the diverse social composition of those who undertook the journey. Wealthy nobles approached the shrine on horseback, accompanied by large retinues and bearing expensive gifts intended to demonstrate both their devotion and their status. Merchants and artisans formed organized groups for mutual protection during the dangerous journey, sharing costs and creating temporary communities bound together by their common spiritual purpose. Common people, for whom pilgrimage represented a significant financial sacrifice, often walked the entire distance to Canterbury, their bare feet bleeding on rough roads as a form of voluntary penance. Many approached the cathedral on their knees for the final miles, their clothing torn and their bodies weakened by the rigors of the journey. These displays of physical suffering were understood not as mere theatrical gestures, but as necessary preparations for encountering the sacred power concentrated at Thomas's shrine. The miracle reports continued to accumulate with extraordinary frequency, each one carefully documented by the cathedral clergy, who understood that maintaining detailed records strengthened claims for Thomas's continuing supernatural activity. The nature of these miracles reflected the full range of medieval concerns about health, justice, and spiritual welfare. Physical healings predominated, but Thomas's intercession was also credited with more complex interventions, reconciling enemies, protecting travelers, ensuring successful harvests, and even influencing political events. King Henry II, still reeling from the international condemnation that followed Thomas's murder, found himself confronting a spiritual and political crisis that threatened to destroy his credibility as a Christian monarch. The rapid growth of Thomas's cult created an implicit but devastating criticism of royal authority, suggesting that God himself had condemned the king's actions through the miraculous vindication of his victim. The breaking point came in 1174, when Henry faced the greatest crisis of his reign, a coordinated rebellion by his own sons and wife, supported by the kings of France and Scotland. As enemy armies invaded his territories and his carefully constructed empire seemed on the verge of collapse, Henry recognized that he needed to make peace with the saint he had inadvertently created. The timing of his decision to undertake penance at Canterbury suggests a man driven to desperation by the apparent divine judgment being executed against his reign. Henry's penance at Canterbury in July 1174 represented one of the most extraordinary spectacles of medieval royal humiliation. The king, who had once commanded absolute obedience from his subjects, now subjected himself to public degradation as a demonstration of his repentance for Thomas's death. His journey to the cathedral began 3 miles outside Canterbury, where he dismounted from his horse and removed his royal boots to walk barefoot through the muddy streets. The sight of England's king walking barefoot through the streets, dressed in rough pilgrimage clothing rather than royal robes, drew enormous crowds of onlookers who could scarcely believe they were witnessing such an unprecedented reversal of royal dignity. Henry's feet, unused to such treatment, soon began bleeding from contact with the sharp stones and debris that littered medieval streets. Each bloody footprint left behind became a testimony to his genuine repentance and a visible symbol of his submission to the spiritual authority he had attempted to challenge. Arriving at Canterbury Cathedral, Henry prostrated himself before Thomas's tomb and submitted to the most dramatic part of his penance, a ritual flogging administered by the very clergy he had once attempted to control. 5 bishops present at the ceremony each administered 5 blows with a rod, followed by all 80 monks of Canterbury Cathedral delivering 3 blows each. The mathematical precision of this punishment, nearly 300 blows in total, reflected medieval understanding of penance as a carefully calibrated spiritual medicine designed to purge the soul of sin through measured physical suffering. Contemporary accounts describe Henry writhing under the accumulated impact of these blows, his royal back soon flowing with blood as the ceremonial beating continued. The monks who administered this punishment faced the extraordinary psychological challenge of striking their king while maintaining the religious dignity appropriate to such a solemn ritual. The careful regulation of the beating, specified numbers of blows, prescribed implements, formal procedures, transformed what might have been mere violence into a sacred ritual of purification and reconciliation. Following the flogging, Henry spent the entire night in prayer and vigil beside Thomas's tomb, refusing all offers of food, comfort, or medical attention. His presence in the cathedral crypt, kneeling in his own blood while maintaining a sleepless vigil, represented the complete inversion of everything his reign had stood for. The king who had demanded absolute submission from the church now demonstrated his own absolute submission to the power of a murdered saint. The dramatic vindication of Henry's penance came with stunning swiftness. On the very day following his night-long vigil, news arrived that William the Lion, King of Scotland, had been captured by Henry's forces near Alnwick Castle. This military victory, achieved precisely while Henry knelt in penance at Thomas's shrine, was interpreted by contemporaries as unmistakable evidence that the saint had forgiven the king and restored divine favor to his reign. The rebellion that had threatened to destroy Henry's empire collapsed with remarkable speed following his reconciliation with Thomas's memory. His sons abandoned their revolt and begged forgiveness. His wife Eleanor was captured and imprisoned, and the foreign allies who had supported the rebellion withdrew their forces. The correlation between Henry's penance and these dramatic reversals of fortune convinced even skeptics that Thomas possessed genuine supernatural power and that his forgiveness could reshape earthly events. Henry's public reconciliation with Thomas's cult transformed the relationship between crown and church in ways that would influence English politics for centuries. The king's dramatic submission to ecclesiastical authority established precedents for the limitation of royal power that would later contribute to developments like Magna Carta and the gradual evolution of constitutional monarchy. Thomas's victory over royal authority, achieved through martyrdom rather than political maneuvering, demonstrated that spiritual power could triumph over temporal force when guided by principle and vindicated by divine intervention. The long-term impact of Thomas's cult extended far beyond the immediate political settlement between Henry and the Church. Canterbury's development as a pilgrimage centre generated enormous wealth that funded the cathedral's reconstruction in the magnificent Gothic style that still impresses modern visitors. The economic activity generated by hundreds of thousands of annual pilgrims created an entire industry of hospitality, transportation, and religious commerce that transformed the regional economy. The cultural influence of Thomas's story spread throughout medieval Europe, inspiring artistic works, literary compositions, and theological treatises that explored the relationship between martyrdom and sanctity. His murder became one of the most frequently depicted scenes in medieval art, appearing in everything from illuminated manuscripts to cathedral sculptures to stained glass windows. Each artistic representation reinforced the moral lesson of his story, that righteous suffering could triumph over worldly power, and that divine justice ultimately prevailed over human injustice. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written 2 centuries after Thomas's death, demonstrates the continuing cultural significance of his cult, while revealing how pilgrimage had evolved into a complex social phenomenon. Chaucer's pilgrims represent every level of medieval society, united by their common journey to Thomas's shrine, but divided by their different motivations, social positions, and moral characters. The tales they tell during their journey reflect the full spectrum of medieval concerns and values, suggesting that Thomas's cult had become a lens through which English society examined itself. The theological significance of Thomas's canonization extended beyond his personal sanctity to address fundamental questions about the relationship between church and state, individual conscience and political authority, divine law and human government. His willingness to die rather than compromise his principles established him as a model for clerical resistance to secular encroachment, inspiring future generations of church leaders to assert spiritual authority against political pressure. Yet Thomas's legacy was not without its critics and complications. Some contemporary observers questioned whether his stubborn resistance to royal authority represented genuine sanctity or merely political ambition cloaked in religious rhetoric. The speed of his canonization, the commercial exploitation of his cult, and the political uses to which his memory was put all raise questions about the authenticity of medieval sainthood and the relationship between spiritual and worldly power. The destruction of Thomas's shrine during Henry VIII's Reformation in 1538 represented a deliberate attempt to erase his memory and symbolic significance. Henry VIII, facing his own conflicts with papal authority, recognized Thomas as a dangerous precedent for clerical resistance to royal supremacy. The systematic obliteration of his cult, the destruction of his shrine, the suppression of his feast day, the prohibition of pilgrimages to Canterbury, demonstrated the continuing political relevance of his example more than 3 centuries after his death. The enduring fascination with Thomas Becket's story reflects its embodiment of timeless themes that transcend its specific medieval context. His transformation from royal favorite to martyred saint explores the corruption of friendship by power, the price of moral conviction, and the complex relationship between personal ambition and spiritual calling. His murder and subsequent canonization raise profound questions about the nature of authority, the limits of loyalty, and the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs. Modern interpretations of Thomas's life and death continue to evolve, reflecting changing perspectives on political authority, religious conviction, and historical narrative. Some historians emphasize his role as a defender of clerical privilege and institutional independence, while others view him as an early advocate for the rule of law and constitutional limitation of royal power. Still others focus on the psychological dimensions of his relationship with Henry II, exploring the personal dynamics that transformed intimate friendship into murderous hatred. The archaeological investigation of Canterbury Cathedral continues to reveal new aspects of Thomas's cult and its material impact on medieval society. Excavations have uncovered thousands of pilgrimage badges, ampullae, and other devotional objects that demonstrate the international scope of his veneration. Analysis of human remains found near his shrine suggests that pilgrims often died during their journey to Canterbury, their final resting place in the cathedral crypt testament to their faith in his miraculous powers. The cathedral itself serves as a living monument to Thomas's continuing significance. Its Gothic architecture funded by pilgrimage revenues, and its layout designed to accommodate the ritual requirements of saint veneration. The site of his murder, marked today by a simple stone plaque, remains a place of pilgrimage and reflection for visitors who seek to understand the intersection of faith, politics, and personal conviction that his story represents. In the final analysis, Thomas Becket's transformation from murdered archbishop to powerful saint reveals the extraordinary capacity of medieval society to transform political tragedy into spiritual triumph. His death, intended by his killers to eliminate a troublesome opponent of royal authority, instead created one of Europe's most influential examples of successful resistance to temporal power. The blood spilled on Canterbury's cathedral floor became the foundation for a cult that would challenge royal authority, inspire artistic creation, generate enormous wealth, and provide spiritual comfort to millions of believers across the centuries. His story endures because it dramatizes fundamental tensions that continue to shape human society. The conflict between individual conscience and institutional authority, the struggle between spiritual values and political expediency, the question of whether divine justice ultimately prevails over human injustice. Thomas Becket's murder and canonization demonstrate that even in the brutal world of medieval politics, there remains space for the assertion of moral principle and the vindication of righteous suffering. The Archbishop, who died defending the independence of gods,